Chapter 6 A Girl with Pointy Shoes. The kitchen had changed since my last visit. A small fire had been made up in the grate, and 2 plates of bacon and eggs were on the table. There was a freshly baked loaf, too, and a large pat of butter. "Tuck in, lad, before it gets cold," invited the spook. I set to immediately, and it didn't take us long to finish off both platefuls and eat half the loaf as well. Then the spook leaned back in his chair, tugged at his beard, and asked me an important question. "Don't you think," he asked, his eyes staring straight into mine, "that was the best plate of bacon and eggs you've ever tasted?" I didn't agree. The breakfast had been well cooked. It was good, all right, better than cheese, but I'd tasted better. I'd tasted better every single morning when I'd lived at home. My mam was a far better cook, but somehow I didn't think that was the answer the spook was looking for. So I told a little white lie, the kind of untruth that doesn't really do any harm and tends to make people happier for hearing it. "Yes," I said. "It was the very best breakfast that I've ever tasted, and I'm so sorry for coming down early, and I promise that it won't happen again." At that, the spook grinned so much that I thought his face was going to split in two. Then he clapped me on the back and told me out in the garden and led me out in the garden again. It was only when we were outside that the grin finally faded. "Well done, lad," he said. "There are 2 things that respond well to flattery: Bogarts and some women. Gets them every time." Well, I hadn't seen any sign of a woman in the kitchen, so it confirmed what I'd suspected, that a Bogart cooked our meals. It was a surprise, to say the least. Everyone thought that a spook was a Bogart slayer, or that he fixed them so that they couldn't get up to any mischief. Who would have credited that he had one cooking and cleaning for him? "This is the western garden," the spook told me as we were walking along the third path, the white pebbles crunching under our feet. "It's a safe place to be whether it's day or night. I often come here myself when I've got a problem that needs thinking through." We passed through another gap in the hedge and were soon walking through the trees. I felt the difference right away. The birds were singing and the trees were swaying slightly in the morning breeze. It was a happier place. We kept walking until we came out of the trees onto a hillside with a view of the fells to our right. The sky was so clear that I could see the dry stone walls that divided the lower slopes into fields and marked out each farmer's territory. In fact, the view extended right to the summits of the nearest fell. The spook gestured toward a wooden bench to our left. "Take a pew, lad," he invited. I did as I was told and sat down. For a few moments the spook stared down at me, his green eyes locked upon mine. Then he began to pace up and down in front of the bench without speaking. He was no longer looking at me, but stared into space with a vacant expression in his eyes. He thrust back his long black cloak and put his hands in his breeches pockets. Then, very suddenly, he sat down beside me and asked questions. "How many different types of Bogart do you think there are?" I hadn't a clue. "I know 2 types already," I said, "the free and the bound, but I couldn't even begin to guess about the others." "That's good twice over, lad. You've remembered what I taught you, and you've shown yourself to be someone who doesn't make wild guesses. You see, there are as many different types of Bogart as there are types of people, and each one has a personality of its own. Having said that, though, there are some types that can be recognized and given a name, sometimes on account of the shape they take, and sometimes because of their behavior and the tricks they get up to." He reached into his right pocket and pulled out a small book bound with black leather. Then he handed it to me. "Here, this is yours now," he said. "Take care of it, and whatever you do, don't lose it." The smell of leather was very strong, and the book appeared to be brand new. It was a bit of a disappointment to open it and find it full of blank pages. I suppose I'd expected it to be full of the secrets of the spook's trade. But no, it seemed that I was expected to write them down, because next the spook pulled a pen and a small bottle of ink from his pocket. "Prepare to take notes," he said, standing up and beginning to pace back and forth in front of the bench again. "And be careful not to spill the ink, lad. It doesn't dribble from a cow's udder." I managed to uncork the bottle. Then, very carefully, I dipped the nib of the pen into it and opened the notebook at the first page. The spook had already begun the lesson, and he was talking very fast. "Firstly, there are hairy Bogarts, which take the shape of animals. Most are dogs, but there are almost as many cats and the odd goat or 2. But don't forget to include horses as well. They can be very tricky. And whatever their shape, hairy Bogarts can be divided up into those that are hostile, friendly, or somewhere in between. Then there are hall knockers, which sometimes develop into stone chuckers, which can get very angry when provoked. One of the nastiest types of all is the cattle ripper, because it's just as partial to human blood. But don't run away with the idea that we spooks just deal with boggarts, because the unquiet dead are never far away. Then, to make things worse, witches are a real problem in the county. We don't have any local witches to worry about now, but to the east, near Pendle Hill, they're a real menace. And remember, not all witches are the same. They fall into four rough categories: the malevolent, the benign, the falsely accused, and the unaware. By now, as you might have guessed, I was in real trouble. To begin with, he was talking so fast I hadn't managed to write down a single word. Secondly, I didn't even know all the big words he was using. However, just then he paused. I think he must have noticed the dazed expression on my face. "What's the problem, lad?" he asked. "Come on, spit it out. Don't be afraid to ask questions." "I didn't understand all that you said about witches," I said. "I don't know what malevolent means, or benign either." "Malevolent means evil," he explained. "Benign means good. And an unaware witch means a witch who doesn't know she's a witch, and because she's a woman, that makes her double trouble. Never trust a woman." "My mother's a woman," I said, suddenly feeling a little angry, "and I trust her." "Mothers usually are women," said the spook, "and mothers are usually quite trustworthy, as long as you're their son. Otherwise, look out. I had a mother once and I trusted her, so I remember the feeling well." "Do you like girls?" he asked suddenly. "I don't really know any girls," I admitted. "I don't have any sisters." "Well, in that case, you could fall easy victim to their tricks, so watch out for the village girls, especially any who wear pointy shoes. Jot that down. It's as good a place to start as any." I wondered what was so terrible about wearing pointy shoes. I knew my mam wouldn't be happy with what the spook had just said. She believed you should take people as you find them, not just depend on someone else's opinion. Still, what choice did I have? So at the top of the very first page, I wrote down, "Village girls with pointy shoes." He watched me write, then asked me for the book and pen. "Look," he said, "you're going to have to take notes faster than that. There's a lot to learn, and you'll have filled a dozen notebooks before long, but for now 3 or 4 headings will be enough to get you started." He then wrote Harry Boggarts at the top of the page 2, then Hall Knockers at the top of page 3, then finally Witches at the top of page 4. "There," he said, "that's got you started. Just write anything you learned today under one of those 4 headings. But for now, something more urgent. We need provisions, so go down to the village or we'll go hungry tomorrow. Even the best cook can't cook without provisions. Remember that everything goes inside my sack. The butcher has it, so go there first. Just ask for Mr. Gregory's order." He gave me a small silver coin, warning me not to lose my change, then sent me off down the hill on the quickest route to the village. Soon I was walking through the trees again, until at last I reached a stile that brought me onto a steep, narrow lane. 100 or so paces lower, I turned a corner, and the gray slates of Chippenden's rooftops came into view. The village was larger than I'd expected. There were at least 100 cottages, then a pub, a schoolhouse, and a big church with a bell tower. There was no sign of a market square, but the cobbled main street, which sloped quite steeply, was full of women with loaded baskets scurrying in and out of the shops. Horses and carts were waiting on both sides of the street, so it was clear that the local farmers' wives came here to shop, and no doubt also folk from hamlets nearby. I found the butcher's shop without any trouble and joined a queue of boisterous women, all calling out to the butcher, a cheerful, big, red-faced man with a ginger beard. He seemed to know every single one of them by name, and they kept laughing loudly at his jokes, which came thick and fast. I didn't understand most of them, but the women certainly did, and they really seemed to be enjoying themselves. Nobody paid me much attention, but at last I reached the counter, and it was my turn to be served. "I've called for Mr. Gregory's order," I told the butcher. As soon as I'd spoken, the shop became quiet and the laughter stopped. The butcher reached behind the counter and pulled out a large sack. I could hear people whispering behind me, but even straining my ears, I couldn't quite catch what they were saying. When I glanced behind, they were looking everywhere but at me. Some were even staring straight at the floor. I gave the butcher the silver coin, checked my change carefully, thanked him, and carried the sack out of the shop, swinging it up onto my shoulder when I reached the street. The visit to the greengrocer's took no time at all. The provisions there were already wrapped, so I put the parcel in the sack, which was now starting to feel a bit heavy. Until then, everything had gone well, but as I went into the baker's, I saw the gang of lads. There were 7 or 8 of them, sitting on a garden wall. Nothing odd about that, except for the fact that they weren't speaking to one another. They were all busy staring at me with hungry faces, like a pack of wolves, watching every step I took as I approached the baker's. When I came off the shop, they were still there, and now, as I began to climb the hill, they started to follow me. Well, although it was too much of a coincidence to think that they'd just decided to go up the same hill, I wasn't that worried. 6 brothers had given me plenty of opportunity to fight. I heard the sound of their boots getting closer and closer. They were catching up with me pretty quickly, but maybe that was because I was walking slower and slower. You see, I didn't want them to think I was scared. In any case, the sack was heavy and the hill I was climbing was very steep. They caught up with me about a dozen paces before the stile, just at the point where the lane divided a small wood, the trees crowding in on either side to shut out the morning sun. "Open up the sack and let's see what we've got," said a voice behind me. It was a loud, deep voice, accustomed to telling people what to do. There was a hard edge of danger that told me its owner liked to cause pain and was always looking for his next victim. I turned to face him, but gripped the sack even tighter, keeping it firmly on my shoulder. The one who'd spoken was the leader of the gang. There was no doubt about that. The rest of them had thin, pinched faces, as if they were in need of a good meal, but he looked as if he'd been eating for all of them. He was at least a head taller than me, with broad shoulders and a neck like a bull's. His face was broad too, with red cheeks, but his eyes were very small, and he didn't seem to blink. I suppose, if he hadn't been there and hadn't tried to bully me, I might have relented. After all, some of the boys looked half-starved, and there was a lot of apples and cakes in the sack. On the other hand, they weren't mine to give away. "This doesn't belong to me," I said. "It belongs to Mr. Gregory." "His last apprentice didn't let that bother him," said the leader, moving his big face closer to mine. "He used to open the sack for us. If you've any sense, you'll do the same. If you won't do it the easy way, then it'll have to be the hard way. But you won't like that very much, and it'll all come down to the same thing in the end." The gang began to move in closer, and I could feel someone behind me tugging at the sack. Even then, I wouldn't let go, and I stared back into the piggy eyes of the leader, trying hard not to blink. At that moment, something happened that took all of us by surprise. There was a movement in the trees somewhere to my right, and we all turned toward it. There was a dark shape in the shadows, and as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw that it was a girl. She was moving slowly in our direction, but her approach was so silent that you could have heard a pin drop, and so smooth that she seemed to be floating rather than walking. Then she stopped, just on the edge of the tree shadows, as if she didn't want to step into the sunlight. "Why don't you leave him be?" she demanded. It seemed like a question, but the tone in her voice told me it was a command. "What's it to you?" asked the leader of the gang, jutting his chin forward and bunching his fists. "Ain't me you need to worry about," she answered from the shadows. "Lizzie's back, and if you don't do what I say, it's her you'll answer to." "Lizzie?" asked the lad, taking a step backward. "Bony Lizzie. She's my aunt. Don't tell me you ain't heard of her." Have you ever felt time so slow so much that it almost appears to stop? Ever listened to a clock when the next tick seems to take forever to follow the last talk? Well, it was just like that until, very suddenly, the girl hissed loudly through her clenched teeth. Then she spoke again. "Go on," she said. "Be off with you. Be gone. Be quick or be dead." The effect on the gang was immediate. I glimpsed the expression on some of their faces and saw that they weren't just afraid. They were terrified and close to panic. Their leader turned on his heels and immediately fled down the hill, with the others close behind him. I didn't know why they were so scared, but I felt like running too. The girl was staring at me with wide eyes, and I didn't feel able to control my limbs properly. I felt like a mouse paralyzed by the stare of a stout, about to pounce at any moment. I forced my left foot to move and slowly turned my body toward the trees to follow the direction my nose was pointing, but I was still gripping the spook sack. Whoever she was, I still wasn't going to give up. "Ain't you going to run as well?" she asked me. I shook my head, but my mouth was very dry, and I couldn't trust myself to try and speak. I knew the words would come out wrong. She was probably about my own age, if anything, slightly younger. Her face was nice enough, for she had large brown eyes, high cheekbones, and long black hair. She wore a black dress tied tightly at the waist with a piece of white string. But as I took all this in, I suddenly noticed something that troubled me. The girl was wearing pointy shoes, and immediately I remembered the spook's warning. But I stood my ground, determined not to run like the others. "Ain't you gonna thank me?" she asked. "Be nice to get some thanks." "Thanks," I said lamely, just managing to get the word out first time. "Well, that's a start," she said. "But to thank me properly, you need to give me something, don't you? A cake and an apple will do for now. It ain't much to ask. There's plenty in the sack, and old Gregory won't notice. And if he does, he won't say anything. I was shocked to hear her call the spook Old Gregory. I knew he wouldn't like being called that, and it told me two things. First, the girl had little respect for him, and second, she wasn't the least bit afraid of him. Back where I came from, most people shivered even at the thought that the spook might be in the neighborhood. I'm sorry, I said, but I can't do that. They're not mine to give. She glared at me hard and didn't speak for a long time. I thought at one point that she was going to hiss at me through her teeth. I stared back at her, trying not to blink, until at last a faint smile lit up her face and she spoke again. Then I have to settle for a promise. A promise? I asked, wondering what she meant. A promise to help me just as I helped you. I don't need any help right now, but perhaps one day I might. That's fine, I told her. If you ever need any help in the future, then just ask. What's your name? She asked, giving me a really broad smile. Tom Ward. Well, my name's Alice, and I live yonder, she said, pointing back toward the trees. I'm Boney Lizzie's favorite niece. Boney Lizzie was a strange name, but it would have been rude to mention it. Whoever she was, her name had been enough to scare the village lads. That was the end of our conversation. We both turned, then to go our separate ways, but as we walked away, Alice called over her shoulder. Take care now. You don't want to end up like old Gregory's last apprentice. What happened to him? I asked. Better ask old Gregory, she shouted as she disappeared into the trees. When I got back, the spook checked the contents of the sack carefully, ticking things off from a list. Did you have any trouble down in the village? He asked when he had finally finished. Some lads followed me up the hill and asked me to open the sack, but I told them no, I said. That was very brave of you, said the spook. Next time it won't do any harm to let them have a few apples and cakes. Life's hard enough as it is, but some of them come from very poor families. I always order extra in case they ask for some. I felt annoyed then. If only he'd told me that in advance. I didn't like to do it without asking you first, I said. The spook raised his eyebrows. Did you want to give them a few apples and cakes? I don't like being bullied, I said, but some of them did look really hungry. Then next time, trust your instincts and use your initiative, said the spook. Trust the voice inside you. It's rarely wrong. A spook depends a lot on that, because it can sometimes mean the difference between life and death. So that's another thing we need to find out about you, whether or not your instincts can be relied on. He paused, staring at me hard, his green eyes searching my face. Any trouble with girls? He asked suddenly. It was because I was still annoyed that I didn't give a straight answer to his question. No trouble at all, I answered. It wasn't a lie because Alice had helped me, which was the opposite of trouble. Still, I knew he really meant had I met any girls, and I knew I should have told him about her, especially with her wearing pointing shoes. I made lots of mistakes as an apprentice, and that was my second serious one, not telling the spook the whole truth. The first, even more serious one, was making the promise to Alice.